Money buys silence. It does not buy belonging. Every man in that boardroom had a different word for what she was. Unsuitable, unworthy, a liability in a cheap wool coat. And not one of them understood that the more they said it, the faster he would burn his own empire to the ground just to prove them wrong. Salvatore Marchetti had inherited a kingdom built on blood and discretion, and in the space of 6 weeks, he was prepared to hand half of it to a woman who had never once asked him for anything. Rain slicked the long gravel drive of the Marchetti estate in the Hudson Valley, turning the wrought iron gates into black smears against a charcoal sky. Inside the main house, Salvatore stood at the head of a conference table carved from a single slab of Brazilian rosewood, listening to 12 men argue about a dead man's inheritance as though grief itself were a line item to be negotiated. His father, Vittorio Marchetti, had been gone for exactly 41 days, and already the wolves who had once called themselves loyal capos were circling the throne with their tails tucked and their teeth bared. Salvatore was 33 years old, broad through the shoulders in the particular way of a man who had been built for violence and trained instead to wear suits that disguised it. His eyes were a flat, glacial gray, inherited from a mother he barely remembered, and his jaw carried a permanent tension, as though he were perpetually one provocation away from breaking something. He did not raise his voice in meetings. He had learned long ago that silence unsettled men far more efficiently than shouting ever could. Marigold Hayes had no idea any of this was happening above her head. She was 3 floors down, in what had once been Vittorio Marchetti's private study, carefully lifting a Georgian silver inkwell from a velvet-lined drawer and recording its provenance in a leather notebook with handwriting so neat it looked typeset. Mari was an estate appraiser, the kind hired quietly through layers of attorneys to catalog, authenticate, and value the contents of a dead man's life before lawyers decided what got sold, what got kept, and what got buried. She was 29, soft-bodied in a way that had never once been fashionable in the rarefied circles she occasionally found herself working in. With thick auburn hair, she kept twisted up out of her face and a quiet, methodical calm that made dying men and difficult families trust her with their secrets. She had been hired through a Manhattan law firm, vetted through 3 layers of paperwork, and told only that the Marchetti family required absolute discretion. Nobody had told her the family in question ran half the East Coast's illegal shipping routes. Nobody had told her that the silver inkwell she was cataloging had, 3 decades earlier, been used to sign documents that buried men in the foundations of half a dozen New Jersey warehouses. She simply did her job, the way she always did, with a careful reverence for objects that had outlived the people who once loved them. It was the 3rd week of the appraisal when Salvatore first noticed her, not because she sought his attention, but because she resolutely refused to give it. Most people who entered the Marchetti estate walked through it like they were crossing a minefield, eyes down, voices hushed, desperate not to be noticed by the dangerous men who moved through its halls. Mari walked through it like she owned a piece of every room, because in a sense she did. She understood every object in that house more intimately than the family who had inherited it. He found her in the East Wing gallery one evening, perched on a step stool, gently turning over an oil painting to examine the back of the canvas, completely unbothered by his presence in the doorway. "That painting belonged to my grandmother," Salvatore said, more to test her reaction than out of genuine conversation. Mari did not startle. She glanced over her shoulder, assessed him with the same clinical curiosity she gave the canvas, and said, "Then your grandmother was swindled. This is a very good forgery of a much better original. I put the real one somewhere around 1951, sold privately, probably to someone in Milan who knew exactly what they were buying." Salvatore felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a name for yet. Nobody spoke to him with that kind of unbothered honesty. Nobody in his world had the luxury of indifference toward him, because indifference toward a man like Salvatore Marchetti could get a person killed. And yet here was a soft, round-faced woman in a cardigan 2 sizes too big, calmly informing him that his family had been cheated, without the faintest awareness that she was speaking to the most dangerous man in 3 states. He found himself returning to the East Wing more often after that, ostensibly to check on the progress of the appraisal, though both of them understood within days that his visits had very little to do with antique silver. The capos noticed first. Lorenzo Greco, his father's oldest friend and the family's longtime consigliera, was the first to voice what would become a chorus of quiet, insistent disapproval. He cornered Salvatore in the wine cellar one evening, his voice low and urgent in the way of a man delivering news he believed to be a kindness. The appraiser, Salvatore. People are talking. Salvatore did not look up from the bottle he was inspecting. People always talk, Lorenzo. It's the only productive thing some of them do. She's not one of us. She doesn't understand how this world works. A woman like that, soft, ordinary, no family connections, no protection, she'll either get herself killed or get you killed trying to protect her. Either way, it's a weakness the family can't afford right now. Not with Russo circling the territory, not with your father 6 weeks in the ground. Salvatore finally turned to face him, and something in his expression made Lorenzo take an involuntary step backward. She cataloged 400 objects in this house in 3 weeks and found 2 forgeries my father never knew about. She is the most competent person who has set foot in this estate since the funeral. If competence is a weakness now, Lorenzo, I'd like you to explain to me what strength is supposed to look like. It was not the answer Lorenzo wanted, and it would not be the last time someone in the organization tried to warn Salvatore away from her, but it was the first time he said her name in defense rather than explanation, and somewhere in the lower floors of that conversation, something in him had already decided. The humiliation started small and built like weather. Mari had grown up the youngest of 3 daughters in a family that prized thinness the way other families prized inheritance, where her mother's love came wrapped in careful suggestions about portion sizes, and her older sisters traded cruel nicknames disguised as affection at every holiday dinner. She had built a quiet, private peace with her body over the years, the kind of peace that did not announce itself, but simply existed underneath the noise. But peace built slowly could still be cracked quickly, and the Marchetti estate cracked it in new and creative ways. The first time it happened directly. She was crossing the main foyer with an armful of inventory folders when she overheard 2 of the household staff, women who had worked for the family for decades and considered themselves entitled to opinions about everyone who passed through. Look at her, dragging herself around like she owns the place. One murmured to the other, not quite quietly enough. I heard the boss has been visiting her in the East Wing. Can you imagine? With everything he could have, every woman in this city throwing herself at him. And he picks that. The other laughed, a short, ugly sound. Maybe he likes something soft to grab onto. Mari kept walking, her spine straight, her face arranged into the same calm professional mask she had worn through 100 client meetings, and did not let either of them see that the words had landed exactly where they were aimed. That evening, alone in the small guest cottage the estate had assigned her for the duration of the appraisal, she sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself 15 minutes of quiet, furious tears before washing her face and going back to work, because work was the one thing in her life that had never once asked her to be smaller than she was. The cruelty escalated 2 weeks later, when Mari was summoned to a family dinner she had not asked to attend, ostensibly to present her preliminary findings on the estate's collection to a small circle of Marchetti relatives who had flown in from Chicago and Miami to assess what remained of Vittorio's fortune. Salvatore's aunt, a sharp-featured woman named Rosalind who wore her family loyalty like armor, looked Mari over with open, undisguised distaste the moment she entered the dining room. "So this is the appraiser," Rosalind said, addressing the table rather than Mari directly, as though she were a piece of furniture being discussed for placement rather than a person capable of hearing. "I expected someone more, I don't know. Polished. Salvatore, darling, surely the firm could have sent someone who photographs better for the insurance documentation." A ripple of low laughter moved around the table. Mari felt her face flood with heat, the old familiar shame rising in her chest like floodwater. But before she could find words to excuse herself from the room, Salvatore's voice cut through the laughter with a stillness that silenced it instantly. "She's not here to photograph well, Aunt Rosalind. She's here because she's the most thorough appraiser my lawyers could find on short notice. And in 3 weeks, she's caught discrepancies in this family's collection that nobody noticed in 30 years. If you'd like to discuss her qualifications further, I'm happy to have that conversation. Privately, without an audience, the table went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when someone has said something true that everyone had been too polite to say themselves. Rosalind's mouth thinned, but she said nothing further, and Mari sat through the rest of the dinner with her pulse hammering, equal parts mortified and disbelieving that a man like Salvatore Marchetti had defended her in front of his own family without a moment's hesitation. Later that night, he found her in the garden behind the guest cottage, sitting on a stone bench with her arms wrapped around her knees, staring out at the dark tree line. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly when he sat down beside her. "Defend me at dinner. It'll only make the talking worse. Let them talk," Salvatore said, his voice low and rough in the cool night air. "I've spent my entire life listening to people tell me what I should want, who I should marry, what kind of woman belongs at my table. My father built an empire out of never once caring what anyone thought he should do, and somewhere along the way I forgot that lesson. You reminded me of it." Mari turned to look at him, searching his face for the cruelty or condescension she had braced herself to find, and found instead something raw and unguarded that made her breath catch. "I'm not what anyone pictures when they think about a man like you," she said softly. "I know what I look like, Salvatore. I know I'm not the kind of woman who's supposed to be sitting in gardens with men who run empires." He reached over and took her hand, his palm rough and warm against her soft fingers, and the gesture was so unexpectedly gentle that she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes for an entirely different reason than the ones that had driven her to that bench. "You're the only person in that house who has ever looked at me like I'm a man and not a name on a ledger," he said. "Everyone else sees the empire first. You see me. Do you have any idea how rare that is?" Mari did not have an answer for that, so she simply let him hold her hand in the dark, and somewhere in the silence between them, the foundation of something far more dangerous than an inheritance dispute was quietly being laid. The turn, when it came, arrived without fanfare, in the unremarkable shape of a Tuesday afternoon when Salvatore walked into the East Wing gallery and found Mari on her hands and knees on the parquet floor, sleeves pushed up past her elbows, carefully extracting a stack of yellowed documents from a hidden compartment she had discovered beneath a false bottom in an antique writing desk. "What is that?" he asked, crouching beside her despite the $3,000 suit he was wearing, because curiosity had long ago overridden his concern for appearances when it came to her. Mari held up the brittle papers with the same careful reverence she gave everything in that house. "Shipping manifests. Old ones, looks like from the 70s. There's a ledger underneath them too, handwritten, looks like account records. I almost missed the compartment entirely. The craftsmanship on this desk is exceptional. Whoever built the hiding mechanism really didn't want it found." Salvatore took the ledger from her hands and felt the air leave his lungs as he flipped through the brittle pages. He recognized the handwriting instantly. It belonged to his grandfather, a man who had built the earliest version of the Marchetti operation out of nothing but ambition and ruthlessness, and the ledger detailed financial transactions that, if real, predated even his father's official version of the family's founding story. "This could be worth a great deal to certain people," Salvatore said slowly, his mind already racing through the implications, the leverage, the danger this discovery represented if it fell into the wrong hands. "And dangerous to others," Mari finished for him, watching his face carefully. "I figured as much, given everything I've found cataloging this house. I wasn't going to mention it to anyone outside this room until you'd seen it first. Whatever's in those pages is yours to decide what happens with, not mine." It was such a small thing, such an obvious and uncomplicated act of loyalty, and yet Salvatore found himself staring at her with an intensity that made her flush under the attention. In his world, loyalty was purchased, enforced, or inherited through blood ties that could still be severed by greed or fear. Nobody simply handed him dangerous information and trusted him to handle it correctly without first calculating what they might extract from the moment. "Most people would have sold this to the highest bidder," he said quietly, "or used it as leverage. You found something that could destabilize my entire operation, and your first instinct was to protect me." Mari shrugged, a small, self-deprecating movement that somehow only made him more aware of her. I catalog things for a living, Salvatore. I don't sell secrets. That's not who I am, I know, he said, and the certainty in his voice surprised them both. That's exactly why I trust you more than I trust most of the men sitting at my own table from that afternoon forward. Something between them shifted permanently, the careful distance they had both maintained dissolving into something neither of them had a vocabulary for yet. He began finding reasons to be near her that had nothing to do with appraisals, lingering over coffee in the estate's enormous kitchen while she worked, asking her opinion on decisions that had nothing to do with antiques and everything to do with the weight of running an empire he had inherited too soon. She, in turn, found herself looking forward to his visits with an intensity that frightened her, aware on some fundamental level that falling for a man like Salvatore Marchetti was its own particular kind of danger, the kind that did not announce itself with cruelty the way her family's rejection had, but with warmth that made the eventual loss feel unbearable to imagine. It was during one of those quiet evenings, the two of them sitting on the floor of the gallery surrounded by inventory folders, that Salvatore finally said the thing he had been circling for weeks. Everyone in that boardroom has an opinion about who I should be with, he said, watching her sort through a stack of photographs with careful precision. My aunt thinks I should marry someone from a family with the right connections, someone polished enough to host the kind of parties that keep the legitimate side of the business looking respectable. Lorenzo thinks I should marry no one at all right now, that a wife is a vulnerability the organization can't afford while we're vulnerable to Russo's territory grabs. Not one of them has asked me what I want. Mari did not look up from the photographs in her hands, though her fingers had gone still. And what do you want, Salvatore? He reached over and gently took the photographs from her hands, setting them aside, and when she finally met his eyes, the answer was already written across his face before he spoke it aloud. I want the only person in this house who has never once asked me for anything, who looked at the most dangerous family on the East Coast and decided the only thing worth protecting in it was an old ledger and my reputation. I want you, Mari. I don't care what it costs me with the family. I have spent 33 years being exactly what everyone expected me to be, and I am done with it. Mari's breath caught, the old familiar voice in her head already preparing the rejection she had braced herself to deliver, the careful list of reasons why a man like him could never actually want a woman like her for anything beyond a passing curiosity. But when she opened her mouth, what came out instead was simply, "Then prove it isn't just talk," and so he did. The weeks that followed unfolded with a domestic warmth that neither of them had quite expected, settling into the cracks of an estate that had spent the better part of a year mourning. Mari's appraisal work had officially concluded, the final inventory submitted to the family's attorneys, and yet she found herself still at the estate, ostensibly finishing minor paperwork, in truth simply unable to leave and unwilling to examine too closely why. Salvatore made no attempt to hide the shift in their relationship from the household staff, though he kept it carefully insulated from the wider organization for reasons that had everything to do with protecting her and very little to do with shame. Mornings began with her in the enormous estate kitchen, an apron tied loosely over her clothes, filling the cold marble and steel space with the smell of cinnamon and roasted coffee, a habit she had carried from childhood, the one thing her difficult family had never managed to take from her. Salvatore began appearing in the kitchen doorway most mornings before his security detail arrived, watching her move through the space with an ease that had nothing to do with the careful, calculated grace required in his world and everything to do with simple, unguarded contentment. "You don't have to keep cooking for the whole household," he told her one morning, accepting a plate of something rich and golden without complaint. "There's a private chef on staff for exactly this purpose, I know," Mari said, not looking up from the stove. "I like doing it. It's the one thing in my life nobody has ever managed to make complicated. Flour and butter and heat don't care what I look like, Salvatore. They just do what they're supposed to do." He did not have a response for that, not one that felt adequate. So instead he simply sat at the kitchen island and ate everything she placed in front of him, and let the silence between them say what words could not. It was during this stretch of quiet domesticity that Mari finally met the small, fractured remains of Salvatore's immediate family that he still spoke to with any warmth, a younger half-sister named Isabella who had been mostly raised by an estranged mother in Connecticut and who arrived at the estate one weekend with the particular wariness of a 16-year-old who had learned not to trust easily. Isabella was sharp-tongued and defensive in the way of teenagers who had absorbed too much family chaos too young, and her first instinct upon meeting Mari was suspicion. "Let me guess," Isabella said, looking Mari over with the casual cruelty of adolescence. "You're after his money. Everyone who shows up around here wants something from my brother." Mari did not flinch, though the old wound flared briefly beneath her composure. "I appraised this entire estate without taking a single item for myself, Isabella, including several pieces worth more than most people's houses. If I wanted his money, I think I'd have found an easier way to get it than falling for a man with a security detail and a target on his back." Something in the dry honesty of the answer seemed to catch Isabella off guard, and over the following days, the teenager's wariness slowly softened into something closer to curiosity, then grudging respect, particularly after Mari spent an entire rainy afternoon helping her catalog a box of old family photographs Isabella had found in a forgotten closet. Neither of them speaking much, simply working together in companionable silence. By the end of the weekend, Isabella had attached herself to Mari with the fierce, uncomplicated loyalty of a teenager who had finally found an adult who did not treat her like a problem to be managed, and Salvatore watched the two of them from across rooms with an expression of quiet, disbelieving gratitude that he had not allowed himself to feel in years. But the warmth of those weeks existed alongside a steadily building current of organizational unrest. Word had spread through the upper ranks of the Marchetti operation that the new boss had not merely been spending time with the estate appraiser, but had, by every account, fallen for her completely, and the reaction split sharply along old fault lines. Younger members of the organization, men who had come up under Salvatore's more progressive leadership style, found the whole situation almost romantic, a welcome change from the cold political marriages that had defined the family for generations. The older guard, the men who had served Salvatore's father and measured loyalty in decades rather than years, viewed the relationship as a destabilizing liability at the worst possible time. Russo's organization had been making quiet incursions into Marchetti shipping territory for months, testing the new boss's resolve in the wake of his father's death, and Lorenzo Greco grew increasingly convinced that Salvatore's attention, divided between running an empire under siege and protecting a woman with no understanding of the dangers surrounding her, represented exactly the kind of weakness their enemies were waiting to exploit. He raised the issue again, more forcefully this time, during a closed-door meeting of the family's senior capos, a meeting Salvatore had not realized was happening until Mari mentioned, with careful neutrality, that she had overheard raised voices coming from the study earlier that afternoon. When Salvatore confronted Lorenzo about it that evening, the older man did not bother to soften his position. "The capos are nervous, Salvatore. Russo is testing us, probing our borders, and our response has been a boss who spends his mornings making breakfast plans instead of strategy. I'm not telling you to abandon her. I'm telling you that if you want to keep her safe, you need to be more careful about how visible this relationship becomes, because the moment our enemies realize she matters to you, she becomes a target, and I do not have the resources right now to protect both our territory and a woman who has no idea how to defend herself in this world." It was, in its own bitter way, a warning born of genuine concern rather than simple prejudice, and Salvatore knew it, but the knowledge did not make the warning any easier to hear, particularly not when it arrived alongside the growing, gnawing certainty that someone close to the organization had already begun feeding information to Russo's people, someone whose loyalty Salvatore had never once thought to question. The discovery of the betrayal arrived with the particular cruelty of revelations that come too late to prevent the damage already set in motion. It began with small inconsistencies that Mari, with her appraiser's eye for detail and discrepancy, noticed before anyone in the organization did. A delivery schedule that did not match the shipping manifest she had cataloged months earlier. A security rotation that had been altered without explanation on the same night Salvatore traveled to oversee dock operations in New Jersey. A conversation she overheard in fragments while working late in the estate's library. Lorenzo Greco's voice pitched low and urgent on a phone call he believed nobody could hear, mentioning a meeting location and a timeline that made no sense given what she understood of the family's current strategy against Russo's encroachment. She did not say anything immediately, uncertain whether her instincts were reliable in a world she still did not fully understand. But the unease sat in her stomach like a stone for days until she finally brought her observations to Salvatore, laying out the inconsistencies with the same methodical precision she had once applied to dating a forged painting. Salvatore listened without interrupting, his expression growing colder with each detail she provided, and when she finished, he sat in silence for a long moment before speaking. "Lorenzo has been with this family for 30 years, he said quietly. "He was at my father's side before I was born. If you're right about this, it means the man I trusted most in this organization has been selling us out to Russo. I could be wrong," Mari said carefully, watching the storm building behind his eyes. "I'm not trained for this, Salvatore. I catalog antiques. I don't investigate conspiracies. You cataloged 400 objects in 3 weeks and caught discrepancies that 30 years of family oversight missed," Salvatore said, his voice flat and dangerous in a way she had not heard from him before. "I don't think you're wrong." The confirmation, when it came, arrived faster and more violently than either of them anticipated. Salvatore set a quiet trap, feeding Lorenzo a piece of false information about a shipment route through a channel only the Consigliera had access to, then waited to see whether Russo's people adjusted their movements accordingly. Within 48 hours, the answer was unmistakable. Lorenzo Greco, the man who had stood beside Vittorio Marchetti for 3 decades, who had warned Salvatore so insistently about the dangers of trusting an outsider, had been quietly negotiating with Russo for months, trading inside information about Marchetti operations in exchange for a guaranteed position in the new territorial structure once Russo finished dismantling what remained of the family from the inside. The motive, when it finally surfaced through Salvatore's own quiet investigation, was almost pathetically simple: resentment, decades deep, at having served 2 generations of Marchetti men without ever once being considered family enough to inherit anything of his own. Salvatore had barely processed the full scope of the betrayal when the consequences arrived at the estate's front gates in the form of an armed convoy, Russo's men moving with the coordinated precision of an operation that had been planned for weeks, timed deliberately for a night, when Salvatore's primary security detail had been quietly reassigned by Lorenzo himself under the guise of routine rotation. Mari was in the kitchen when the first gunfire erupted in the front of the house, the sound shattering the quiet domesticity of the evening with a violence that sent her diving instinctively beneath the heavy oak kitchen island, her heart hammering against her ribs as the unmistakable sounds of an assault tore through the estate above her. Salvatore found her there moments later, blood already streaked across his temple from a graze that had narrowly missed something far more catastrophic, his weapon drawn, his expression a terrifying mixture of fury and fear that she had never seen on him before. "We need to move," he said, pulling her up by the arm with a grip that was firm but careful, mindful even in the chaos of not hurting her. "Russo's men have breached the perimeter." Lorenzo gave them the gate codes. Mari's blood ran cold at the confirmation. But there was no time to process the full weight of the betrayal, not with gunfire echoing through the halls above them, and Isabella somewhere upstairs, having arrived for an unplanned weekend visit just hours earlier. "Isabella," Mari gasped, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "She's still in the East Wing." Salvatore's face went rigid with a terror that had nothing to do with his own safety. "I'll get her. You need to get to the panic room beneath the library. It's reinforced. You'll be safe there until—" "I'm not hiding while you go up alone," Mari said, and the steel in her voice surprised them both. "You said yourself I notice things other people miss. Let me help you get her out." There was no time to argue, no time for Salvatore to insist on the protective instincts screaming through every part of him. And so the two of them moved together through the smoke-hazed corridors of the estate, Salvatore clearing each turn with the lethal precision of a man who had been trained for exactly this kind of violence his entire life. Mari moving close behind him with a steadiness that belied the terror flooding her chest, until they reached the east wing and found Isabella crouched behind an overturned bookshelf, white-faced but unharmed, having barricaded herself in with the same sharp instincts that had once made her suspicious of every stranger who entered her brother's life. The reunion was brief, urgent, Salvatore pulling his sister into a fierce embrace before redirecting all three of them toward the hidden passage that led down to the estate's reinforced basement, a passage Mari recognized instantly from her weeks cataloging the property, a detail of the house's construction that would prove, in the chaos of the following minutes, to matter far more than anyone could have anticipated. The confrontation that followed unfolded in the dim, reinforced concrete chamber beneath the estate's east wing, a space originally built decades earlier as a wine cellar and quietly converted by Vittorio Marchetti into something closer to a bunker, its existence known only to family and a handful of the most senior capos. Salvatore had barely sealed the heavy steel door behind the three of them when the sound of pursuit grew audible through the thick walls, footsteps and shouted commands echoing down the stairwell they had just descended. "They know about this room," Salvatore said grimly, checking the magazine of his weapon with hands that remained steady despite the chaos unfolding above them. Lorenzo would have told them everything. Isabella, pressed against the cold concrete wall with her knees drawn to her chest, had gone eerily quiet, the adrenaline of the night finally catching up with her in the form of silent, shaking tears, and Mari moved instinctively to her side, wrapping an arm around the teenager's thin shoulders, murmuring low, steady reassurances even as her own pulse hammered with terror. It was in that moment, surrounded by the staggering wealth of 3 generations of accumulated Marchetti history, gold and documents, and the quiet weight of a family's entire secret legacy, that the heavy steel door groaned and began to give way under sustained assault from outside, the reinforced locks straining against an explosive charge that Russo's men had clearly come prepared to use. Salvatore positioned himself between the door and the 2 women, his weapon raised, his expression a mask of lethal calm that masked the genuine terror coursing beneath it, the terror of a man who understood with perfect clarity that he was about to lose everything that had ever mattered to him in the space of the next 60 seconds. The door blew inward with a deafening concussion, smoke and debris filling the chamber, and through the chaos, 3 armed figures pushed through the breach, weapons raised, moving with the brutal efficiency of men who had done this before. Salvatore fired immediately, dropping the first intruder before he had fully cleared the doorway, but the remaining 2 scattered into the shadows of the vault, returning fire that forced him to take cover behind a heavy steel filing cabinet, the bullets ricocheting off metal with a sound that made Isabella scream despite herself. It was Mari, crouched low against the wall, who noticed what Salvatore in the heat of the firefight could not. One of Russo's men circling wide through the shadowed rows of shelving, flanking toward the position where Salvatore had taken cover, his weapon already rising for a shot that Salvatore would have no time to anticipate. Without allowing herself the space to think through the danger of what she was about to do, Mari grabbed the heaviest object within reach, a solid bronze bust of some long-dead Marchetti patriarch that she had personally cataloged weeks earlier and knew weighed close to 40 pounds, and hurled it with every ounce of strength her body possessed directly into the path of the flanking gunman. The impact caught him squarely across the shoulder and temple, sending him crashing sideways into a shelf of ledgers with a force that knocked the weapon from his hands and gave Salvatore the half-second opening he needed to turn and fire, ending the threat before the man could recover. The final gunman, realizing the engagement had turned decisively against him, attempted to retreat back through the breached doorway, only to be met by the sound of additional footsteps thundering down the stairwell. Salvatore's actual security detail, finally alerted to the breach and arriving in overwhelming numbers, cutting off any possibility of escape. The fight that had felt, in the moment, like it stretched for an eternity, had in reality lasted barely 90 seconds, and when the smoke finally cleared and the vault fell silent except for the ragged sound of everyone's breathing, Salvatore turned to find Mari still gripping the edge of a shelf for balance, her hands shaking violently, Isabella clutching at her other arm, Both of them alive, both of them safe. Entirely because of an instinct Mari had not known she possessed until the moment demanded it of her. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and pulled her into an embrace so fierce it nearly lifted her off the ground, his face buried in her hair, his entire body trembling with the aftershock of terror finally allowed to surface now that the danger had passed. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice cracking in a way she had never heard from him before. "You threw yourself into the middle of a firefight to save my life. You were about to be flanked," Mari said, her own voice unsteady, the adrenaline still flooding her system. "I wasn't going to just stand there and watch." Salvatore pulled back enough to look at her, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch despite the chaos still settling around them. Security personnel beginning the grim work of securing the breach and assessing the damage above. "Lorenzo is still out there somewhere," he said quietly, the fury returning to his expression as the immediate danger passed and the deeper betrayal reasserted itself. "He sold out his own family for a grudge 30 years in the making. He nearly got my sister killed. He nearly got you killed." Within the hour, Salvatore's security teams had located Lorenzo Greco attempting to flee the estate grounds through a service entrance, and the reckoning that followed was swift, absolute, and final in the way that betrayals within an organization like the Marchetti family always were, though Salvatore made certain, in a small but deliberate act of mercy that surprised even his most hardened capos, that Isabella was kept far away from the details of exactly how that particular chapter concluded. In the aftermath, the estate settled into an uneasy quiet, the physical damage from the breach repaired within days by crews who worked with the discreet efficiency such an organization commanded, but the deeper damage, the violation of trust at the very heart of the Marchetti family's inner circle, took considerably longer to address. Salvatore spent the following week in a state of cold, methodical fury, restructuring his entire security apparatus, replacing every position Lorenzo had ever touched, conducting a ruthless internal audit that left no question unanswered about who else within the organization might have been compromised by the same resentments that had driven his former consigliera to betrayal. Throughout it all, Mari remained at the estate, no longer in the guest cottage but in Salvatore's own private quarters, a shift that happened so naturally neither of them had needed to discuss it explicitly. She found herself, in the quiet hours when Salvatore was consumed by the brutal business of rebuilding his organization's trust, spending time with Isabella, the two of them having forged something unbreakable in the crucible of that violent night, and slowly, carefully, beginning to understand the full weight of what it meant to be folded permanently into the orbit of a family like this one. It was Isabella, in fact, who first noticed the change in how the household staff and visiting capos began treating Mari in the days that followed the attack. The whispered comments about her weight, her ordinariness, her unsuitability for a man like Salvatore had not entirely vanished, but they had grown noticeably quieter, replaced by something closer to wary respect, the kind earned by a woman who had thrown a 40-pound bronze bust at an armed assassin to save the lives of the people she loved. Rosalind, the same aunt who had humiliated Mari so thoroughly at that first family dinner, found herself cornered by Isabella in the estate's solarium one afternoon, the teenager's expression sharp with the particular fury of someone defending a person she had come to love. "She saved my life, Aunt Rosalind," Isabella said, her voice carrying none of the deference the family typically expected from its younger members. "She saved Salvatore's life. And you sat at that dinner table and made fun of how she looked. I hope you're proud of yourself." Rosalind, to her credit, had the grace to look genuinely uncomfortable, and the apology she eventually offered Mari, stiff and awkward as it was, marked the beginning of a slow thaw that would, over the following months, transform into something approaching genuine acceptance. But it was Salvatore's own actions, more than anyone else's shifting opinions, that ultimately settled the question of where Mari belonged within his world. 2 weeks after the attack, he called an emergency meeting of the family's senior capos, the same conference table where, months earlier, men had argued about an inheritance as though grief were a line item to be negotiated. This time, Salvatore stood at the head of that table with a stack of legal documents in front of him, his expression carrying none of the careful, diplomatic restraint he typically extended to his organization's older guard. Lorenzo believed that loyalty in this family could be measured in decades of service without ever once being acknowledged as belonging. Salvatore began, his voice carrying through the room with a quiet authority that silenced every conversation before it could begin. He was wrong about a great many things, but he was right about one thing. This family has never been particularly good at recognizing who actually deserves to belong to it. He set the documents on the table, sliding them toward the assembled capos. These are amended ownership structures for the Marchetti shipping operations, the estate holdings, and the family's legitimate business interests. As of today, Marigold Hayes is named as a co-beneficiary and trustee across every major asset this organization holds, with full legal standing equivalent to any blood relative in this room. The reaction was immediate and explosive, a dozen voices rising at once in protest, objection, disbelief, the careful order of the meeting dissolving into chaos that took several minutes to settle. Salvatore did not raise his voice once. He simply waited, his expression carved from stone, until the room exhausted itself into silence. And then he spoke again, quieter this time, but with a weight that landed harder than any shout could have. Every single person in this room told me she didn't belong in this world, that she was ordinary, unsuitable, a liability we couldn't afford. The same woman you all dismissed found a hidden ledger that protects this family's legacy. The same woman caught the financial discrepancies that exposed Lorenzo's betrayal before any of you noticed. The same woman threw herself between an armed assassin and the people she loves without a second's hesitation, while half the men sitting at this table needed an entire security detail just to feel safe in their own homes. I am done listening to anyone in this organization tell me what kind of woman deserves to stand beside me. I have made my decision, and it is final. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the quiet, devastating sound of several of the older capos finally understanding that the boss standing before them was no longer the cautious, diplomatic heir who had inherited his father's empire 6 weeks earlier, but a man who had found, in the most unlikely circumstances, exactly the kind of unwavering loyalty his father had spent a lifetime searching for and never quite trusted enough to recognize when it finally arrived. The weeks that followed the boardroom announcement transformed Mari's life in ways she had never once allowed herself to imagine, even in the privacy of her own quiet daydreams. The legal paperwork, once finalized, made her presence in the Marchetti organization undeniable, irreversible, a fact written into deeds and trust documents that no amount of whispered disapproval could erase. She found herself, almost overnight, attending meetings she had never expected to be invited to, her opinions sought on matters of property, asset management, and the careful curation of the family's legitimate business holdings, her appraiser's eye for value and authenticity proving unexpectedly invaluable to an organization that had, for generations, conflated wealth with worth without ever pausing to examine the distinction. The capos who had once dismissed her settled, slowly and with varying degrees of grace, into a wary professional respect, watching as Salvatore's confidence and clarity as a leader seemed to sharpen rather than soften under her influence. Watching as the organization's territorial conflict with Russo resolved itself within months through a combination of Salvatore's renewed strategic focus and the careful, methodical documentation Mari herself helped assemble, proving Russo's involvement in Lorenzo's betrayal to the satisfaction of every remaining family that mattered. Isabella, for her part, made no secret of her happiness, gleefully informing anyone who would listen that she had personally vetted Mari months before her brother had worked up the nerve to make anything official, a claim that was, in its essential truth, not entirely inaccurate. It was on a quiet evening in early autumn, the estate grounds blazing with the particular gold light that only seemed to exist in the final hour before sunset, that Salvatore found Mari in the East Wing gallery once more, exactly where he had first noticed her months earlier, standing before the same forged painting she had so casually dismissed during their very first conversation. "I had it authenticated properly," he said, coming to stand beside her. You were right, of course. The real one sold in Milan in 1951. I tracked down the current owner. It's coming home, where it belongs. Mari turned to look at him, something soft and disbelieving crossing her features. You didn't have to do that, I know, he said. And then, with a steadiness that belied the magnitude of what he was about to say, he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, dropping to one knee on the same parquet floor where she had once knelt to extract a hidden ledger that had changed both their lives irrevocably. Everyone told me you didn't belong in my world, Mari. They were wrong. You didn't just belong in it. You saved it. You saved me. I have spent my entire life being told what kind of woman a man like me is supposed to want, and I am done listening. I want you. Not the version of you that fits some idea of who belongs at my table, but exactly who you are, soft and brilliant and unshakable. The only person in this entire empire who has never once asked me for anything except the truth. Marry me. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that every single person who ever made you feel like you took up too much space was catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. Mari's hands flew to her mouth, tears spilling freely now. All the old wounds her family had carved into her over decades finally, completely, healing in the space of this one impossible moment. Yes, she whispered, and then, louder, steadier, the word carrying the full weight of a woman who had finally, irrevocably, found a place in the world built specifically to hold her exactly as she was. Yes, Salvatore. 1,000 times yes. He rose and pulled her into his arms, lifting her effortlessly off the ground the way he had done so many times before. The gesture no longer a novelty but a promise, and as the autumn light faded into evening around them, neither of them noticed Isabella watching from the doorway, grinning with the unrestrained joy of a teenager who had finally found something solid and unbreakable to believe in. 1 year later, the Marchetti estate hosted its first wedding in over 2 decades. The same gravel drive that had once carried armed convoys now lined with white roses and string lights. The same conference table where capos had once argued over inheritance now pushed against the wall to make room for a celebration that drew family from every corner of the organization, including, to everyone's quiet astonishment, a stiffly gracious Rosalind, who had spent the better part of the year slowly rebuilding her relationship with the niece-in-law she had once so cruelly dismissed. Mari stood before the altar in a gown that had been tailored specifically to celebrate every curve she had once been taught to hide, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders for the first time anyone at the estate could remember. And when Salvatore turned to watch her walk toward him, the cold, calculating mask he wore for the rest of the world fell away entirely, replaced by an expression of such open, unguarded devotion that several of the older capos in attendance found themselves unexpectedly moved. The legal documents granting her equal standing across every Marchetti holding had long since been absorbed into the quiet, ordinary rhythm of the organization's daily operations, no longer a scandal whispered about in hallways, but simply a fact of how things were. The way Salvatore Marchetti ran his empire, with the woman everyone once told him was wrong for him standing as his equal in every sense that mattered. Isabella served as a witness, beaming through the entire ceremony with the particular pride of someone who had recognized something true long before the adults around her caught up. As the sun set over the Hudson Valley that evening, gilding the estate's gardens in the same warm gold light that had witnessed so much of their story, Salvatore pulled his new wife close during their first dance and murmured against her hair, "They told me you were wrong for me. I have never been more grateful to prove an entire room of powerful, dangerous men catastrophically wrong about anything in my life." Mari laughed, the sound carrying easily over the music, and tightened her arms around him, finally, completely, exactly where she belonged. If this story of an ordinary woman who refused to shrink herself for anyone, who found unexpected courage when it mattered most, and who claimed a place in a world that told her she didn't belong kept you completely hooked from start to finish, please take a moment to hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel grow. If you love stories about powerful men who choose substance over surface, about love that refuses to bend to other people's small-minded expectations, Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that they take up exactly the right amount of space in this world. Subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, heartfelt stories just like this one, dropping every single week, and ring that notification bell so you never miss the next unforgettable journey. Drop a comment below telling us your favorite moment from Salvatore and Mari's story. We read every single one, and we cannot wait to bring you the next epic tale very soon.